Hello and welcome to the third session of this first module. This time we will be looking at the impact of climate change. First, to recap from the last session, we have identified the 6 greenhouse gases and their sources. We have seen the rising carbon dioxide levels and the rising temperatures across the globe. And we have seen how the rising temperatures lead to more extreme weather and have started to see some of the impacts this will have on human health. Further, we have seen that global heating is the continued exaggerated rise in average temperature of the Earth resulting from man-made activities. Climate change is the significant and lasting changes to the weather patterns seen as a result of the rising carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The climate crisis describes the serious problems resulting from climate change, leading to the catastrophic breakdown of the ecosystem services across planet Earth. The effects include ecocide of wildlife, loss of ice caps, rising ocean temperatures and acidification, rising sea levels, increased frequency and severity of droughts and flooding, loss of clean air and water, and rising soil degradation, leading to the lack of ability to grow staple crops such as rice, maize and wheat. By the end of this session, you will have a better understanding of the global vulnerability, the impact of climate crisis on global populations, the anticipated impact on the United Kingdom, a better understanding of the Paris Agreement from 2015, and a review of the Climate Change Act in the United Kingdom from 2008. An increasing number of global organisations, governments and NGOs are concerned about the impacts of climate crisis. Ranging from the Bank of England to the Ministry of Defence, insurance companies and multinational businesses are all recognising the dangers and starting to plan accordingly. For example, in 2019, the World Economic Forum listed the biggest risks over the next decade. The top 5 issues risked by likelihood were around the climate crisis and environmental issues, and 4 in the top 5 of the impacts. As was discovered in early 2020, the impact of infectious diseases was anticipated to be highly significant, but was not considered to be a likely occurrence. Should we consider the climate crisis as just an environmental problem? The obvious answer is no. The climate affects many other areas, from public health to economics and financial issues and national security. The climate is responsible for food and water security of the planet. We will start by looking at the vulnerability of different countries from around the world and their human populations. We can keep referring back to this diagram and the 9 different impacts that climate crisis is having. Different places and different populations will be vulnerable to different impacts from the extremes of weather, rising sea level and rising temperatures. Some countries and populations will be more at risk from increasing disease. For others, problems will stem from the lack of food or water security, and others from the direct effects of heat. Unfortunately, some places and people will suffer multiple effects. Unsurprisingly, as a result of these impacts, there are anticipated to be environmental refugees, with some estimating up to 1 billion people on the move by 2050. So which countries and places are most vulnerable, and why is this the case? Can we work out who is at greatest risk? There are 12 places listed here. Which ones are going to be most vulnerable to climate change, and which ones least? Please pause the video at this point and arrange them into 2 groups, those most vulnerable and those least vulnerable. Welcome back. How do you think you did? These are the most vulnerable places from those provided. Lagos is at a disadvantage because it is considered to be one of the fastest growing cities in the world, and the infrastructure is anticipated to strain under the anticipated doubling of the population over the next 15 years. Residents are expected to suffer from drought, lack of fresh drinking water, extreme heat and rising sea levels. Haiti is in the Atlantic hurricane basin and highly vulnerable to increasing frequency and ferocity of hurricanes. Lack of disaster preparedness and economic development are major setbacks. Rising sea levels are expected to contaminate fresh water and agricultural land. Yemen suffers from weak institutions, wars, drought and famine, leading to food shortages. Infectious diseases such as malaria are becoming more common. Kiribati are Pacific islands which are only 6 feet above sea level. Each year, sea level rises about 1.5 centimetres without factoring in sea swell or storm damage. 2 of their islands disappeared under the sea in 1999. The coral atolls are also threatened by sea acidification and bleaching and has caused death of 80% so far. Are there any factors that link the lowest risk countries? Different countries are likely to face different risks. We saw from the last session that global temperature rise is not uniform across the planet, and as such, the impact is not evenly felt. We can see from this that African countries, Central American countries, and the Caribbean are most vulnerable to climate change. Are the countries who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis also the ones most responsible for its creation? To be able to answer that, we need to look at who generates the most greenhouse gases. However, there are a couple of different methods to measure the carbon equivalent emissions. They can be called direct carbon footprint and consumption carbon footprints. What is the difference between the two, and why does it matter? One way is to add up the amount of greenhouse gases produced within a company, organisation, or in this case, the country. This is relatively straightforward and adds up, for example, all of the fossil fuels used for energy generation, number of litres of petrol sold, etc. This is the direct carbon footprint. We can see that some countries have a very low direct carbon footprint per capita. India, China and Brazil have around 5 tonnes per person per year or less. Other countries, such as Canada, America and Australia, have a very high direct carbon footprint, around 24 tonnes per person or greater. However, what would happen if the manufacture of goods was moved from country A to country B, but the goods were sent back to and used in country A? Who is then responsible for the carbon footprint of those goods? For example, if all the steel in the world was produced in China, but exported to Europe for use in kitchen goods and cars, should the carbon be added to the China total or to the European Union? This is called consumption-based carbon. As the UK and a lot of other Western companies and countries have moved their base of manufacture to Asia and elsewhere, their direct carbon footprint is looking like it's reducing. And this is because they no longer manufacture the goods themselves. However, this is a little false accounting. The global carbon footprint would be unchanged, but the country it was allocated to would be changed. Richer Western countries could claim their carbon emissions were reducing, but those from Asia were increasing, despite the reason for this being due to the supply chain for the goods moving. We can see this by the decrease in the consumption footprints from China, India and the rise in Canada, America and Australia. In the UK, the consumption footprint is nearly 50% bigger than the direct footprint. As we saw in the last session, carbon dioxide is a molecule which consists of 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. It is important to recognise this, as another accounting fiddle can be used when reporting carbon emissions rather than carbon dioxide. Some reports list the amount of carbon produced, others the amount of carbon dioxide. It is important to notice the difference between the two. Because carbon dioxide is a heavier molecule, thanks to the oxygen atoms, 1 kilogram of carbon produces 3.67 kilos of carbon dioxide. Therefore, reports of 100 tonnes of carbon would be the same as 367 tonnes of carbon dioxide, quite a difference. Of course, some companies and countries would report the lower number if they could. We can now start to combine the information from the Global Vulnerability Index with the amount of per capita greenhouse gas generation. Those who generate the least greenhouse gases are often top of those most vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis. Those who have caused least damage are paying the highest price. The countries hit hardest by the impact of climate change will be the low-lying nations, uniquely vulnerable to sea level rise, and developing countries that lack the resources to adapt to temperature and precipitation changes. But wealthy nations are increasingly vulnerable as well due to inequality in wealth and opportunities within countries. In the United States, many millions of Americans, particularly children, the elderly and the impoverished, are already suffering the wrath of the climate crisis. In late 2019, a coronavirus emerged and caused a worldwide pandemic. The impact hit some communities, populations and individuals far harder than others. A Public Health England report showed those most affected were older, from a deprived background, from an ethnic minority background or a low-skilled worker. While those who were financially secure could buy food and toilet rolls in bulk, those who were less financially stable could not. Those who were working in more management and senior roles found the transition to working from home easier than those in more manual jobs. They could afford fast internet connections, new microphones, cameras or computers. Those who had adequate space at home or in their neighbourhood found it easier to keep physically distanced from others than those in crowded housing schemes or large households. those who had pre-existing non-communicable diseases through a lifetime of lack of access to a good healthy diet and opportunities to exercise suffered the greatest death toll. Those who lived in areas with high levels of air pollution had a higher death rate. Equity achieves fairness through treating people differently dependent upon need, not treating everyone the same regardless of need. Altruism and a sense of community grew across the United Kingdom during the coronavirus outbreak. People helped those who needed it most. The climate crisis has been described by some as the coronavirus pandemic on steroids. The effects are going to be felt by those who are too poor to move from areas which are more likely to flood, those with fewer opportunities to be financially secure, those who cannot afford to avoid the worst of the extreme weathers or to ensure their homes and livelihoods. To reduce the worst of the climate crisis affecting those most vulnerable, those who are able can find the altruistic spirit and help those who are most in need. The world has started to recognise the increasing threat from the climate crisis and that global heating can be mitigated only with global action. We need hope, but above all, we need action. The United Nations Convention on Climate Change had met 20 times before meeting in Paris in 2015. There, world leaders representing 195 nations came to an agreement on an accord that has commitments from all countries aimed at combating climate change and adapting to its negative impacts. The Paris Agreement is a landmark environmental accord and a historic turning point for global climate action, with nearly every nation adopting it. The deal aims to substantially reduce global greenhouse emissions in an effort to limit the global temperature increase this century to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, while pursuing means to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. The agreement included commitments from all major emitting countries to cut their climate-altering pollution and to strengthen those commitments over time. The agreement has a pathway for developed nations to assist developing nations in their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. It also creates a framework for the transparent monitoring, reporting and ratcheting up of countries' individual and collective climate goals. There were 3 main aims from Paris 2015. Firstly, limit global temperature rise by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The science shows that more damage from the climate crisis occurs with temperature rises over 2 degrees. Therefore, the Paris Agreement agreed to limit this to well below 2 degrees. Secondly, to provide a framework for transparency, accountability and the achievement of more ambitious targets. And thirdly, to mobilise support for climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing nations. Following the agreement in 2015, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, produced a special report in 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and global greenhouse gas emission pathways. This was to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change, sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. To summarise this report into one key finding was that if we are going to have a reasonable chance of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees, we have just over 10 years to cut global emissions by 50% based on 2010 levels. We then have a further 2 decades, until 2050, to reach zero net emissions. We have already burned through a large portion of our carbon budget, and recently at an alarming rate. It is clear from the report that if emissions continue unabated, even with the country's current climate commitments being fully implemented, we blow through the budget in just about a decade's time. Doing so would expose the world to even more severe heat waves, sea level rises, extreme rainfall and other climate impacts. The IPCC makes it clear that we can no longer emit at our carbon-intensive rate if we are to avoid the worst climate impacts. We must instead rapidly turn around our emissions trajectory. The IPCC does not set policy, but their reports drive policy decisions in many countries. For example, the United Kingdom government tightened the Climate Change Act in 2019 with a new target of net zero carbon by 2050. More on this shortly. What about in the United Kingdom? What are the anticipated impacts of the climate crisis here at home? We can think about heat and its contribution to wildfires. We can think about weather events and increasing frequency and ferocity of storms and rainfall. We can think about water-based events such as flooding and rising sea levels. And we can start to consider the causes and effects of air pollution, especially on the cardiovascular and respiratory health of the population. What has been happening to the temperature in the United Kingdom? The Met Office has looked back over their records, and we can see that the United Kingdom is, on average, getting hotter. It is not only global temperatures which are increasing. The Met Office's State of the UK Climate Report for 2018 shows the 10 hottest years in the United Kingdom since 1884 have all happened in the last 17 years. Increasingly, we see temperature records being broken. The average temperature in 1892 was just over 7 degrees. By contrast, in 2014, which was the warmest year in the series, saw an average United Kingdom temperature approaching 10 degrees. The impact of the temperature rises is seen with the increasing wildfires. One particularly large fire in recent years was on Saddleworth Moor in June 2018. It occurred during the heatwave that year. This one fire affected an area of nearly 4,500 acres and was described as the biggest fire in living memory. It led to the evacuation of 150 people in the area. The military were called in to help, and the Chinook Army helicopters were used to transport water pumps and equipment. Things got worse the following year. 2019 saw more large wildfires than any year previously. In April 2019, the New Scientist reported the total area burned in 2019 so far is over 17,000 hectares, almost on a par with the highs of 2018 and 2011, but with 8 months of the year left to go. The health of the population is affected by wildfires. During the Saddleworth Moor fire, air quality levels across Manchester dropped due to smoke and ash drifting across the city from the fire, forming a widespread haze at ground level. Emergency services supplied dust masks to residents living closest to the fire. 4 local schools were closed as a result, and residents were advised to keep their doors and windows closed. GP services treated numerous people suffering from respiratory illnesses related to the fire. The burning caused particulate pollution to reach towns over 37 miles away. This pollution reached an 8 out of 10 on the air quality index, with 10 being the very highest amount of pollution. We can measure air quality and we can understand the link to respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Fine and not so fine particulate matter can be seen. But because carbon dioxide is invisible, it is harder for us to link this to the damage being caused. Besides the human health impacts, the effects of the Saddleworth Moor fire could last for up to 15 years according to local wildlife experts, while the economic impact was estimated to be over £20 million. We can also think about flood risk. A paper from 2019 estimated the global population at risk from sea level rise using a new calculation method. The authors argued that previous models are based on satellite data and can overestimate the elevation of coastal areas because the satellites are seeing the tops of trees, buildings and vegetation rather than true ground level. Using the new model, the study revised upwards previous estimates of global vulnerability to rising seas, tripling the estimates made using NASA's dataset. Under a lower emission scenario, the study suggests that 190 million people will live on land below projected high tide lines, while for a very high emission scenario, this rises to 500 million. We can consider flood risk to the United Kingdom. We have seen multiple floods over the last decade. In the future, there are 2 different scenarios depending on the amount of greenhouse gases emitted and the amount of temperature rise. The IPCC expects, if emissions stay high, that this would expose an additional 250,000 to 400,000 people across Europe to river flooding and another 5.5 million per year to coastal flooding. The United Kingdom is likely to be one of the worst affected locations. Climate Central is an independent organisation of leading scientists and journalists researching and reporting the facts about our changing climate and the impact to the public. They have worked on data to show projections of the land expected to be flooded by 2050. This is London. The Thames Flood Barrier is the largest movable flood barrier in the world. It's marked on the map and near Woolwich. It protects 125 square kilometres of London. It spans 520 metres and has 10 steel gates that can be raised to protect against storm and tidal surges. It was officially opened in May 1984. It was anticipated to be closed 2 or 3 times a year for flooding. By the 2000s, it has been used 6 or 7 times a year, including 50 times in 2013 to 14. According to the government report, Future Floodings by DEFRA, there are over 2 million properties at risk, with the average annual damage of nearly £1.5 billion, with an additional 800 million spent on flood and coastal defences. Under a high carbon emissions scenario, this is calculated to rise to 27 billion by the year 2070. The impact on the rural area will differ from that in urban areas. Agricultural land is more likely to be lost, with the effects felt on crop yield, which in turn affects food security and the ability for the population to have a healthy diet. This is the projected land in Norfolk and the Wash, and that which is expected to be flooded by 2050. So future increases in urban flooding would be compounded by the additional risks to health and higher costs of repairs to properties. There will be substantial health implications, particularly when the floodwaters carry pollutants or are mixed with foul waters from drains or agricultural land. The floodwaters could also cause indirect health hazards by making sewage treatment works inoperable for extended periods. There will be mental health consequences. Besides the considerable stress of extensive damage, the threat of repeated flooding, coupled with the possible withdrawal of insurance cover, can cause anxiety and depression in the victims in the long term. The socially disadvantaged will be hardest hit. The poor are less able to afford flooding insurance and less able to pay for expensive repairs. People who are ill or who have disabilities will be more vulnerable to the immediate hazard of the flood and to health risks due to polluted floodwaters. This is the projected land in Newcastle, expected to be below the annual flood level in 2050. We also need to consider air pollution. The National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory report on the emissions of pollutants which affect air quality. These include nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide and ozone amongst others. In addition to the damage done to human health, other problems of air pollution include adverse effects on buildings and vegetation, the acidification of streams and lakes, and damage to the aquatic environment. Nitrogen-based pollutants alter the balance of nutrients in soils, rivers and lakes and lead to blooms of algae, upsetting the diversity of species in sensitive environments. Ground-level ozone precursors play a key role in ozone formation, and this can affect both human health and damage plants and crops. Fine particulate matter are small particles measuring less than 2.5 microns, the same as 0.0025 mm in size. These can enter the lungs causing damage, but can also enter the bloodstream and become deposited in different organs. This is a map of the air quality in London, specifically looking at this particulate matter less than 2.5 microns in size. As we have seen on a global scale, there will be a variety of impacts in different places. The UK is no different in this regard, and various parts of the country are likely to experience different complications from the climate crisis. Some will have changes to water level, leading to droughts and flooding. This will have effects on what food could be grown or how severe any disruption to water supply for households are. Sea level rises will naturally affect coastal regions. Changes to weather patterns will see more frequent storms, likely wetter winters and drier summers. And a loss of area of the natural world would lead to the loss of different species of wildlife. The United Kingdom was one of the first countries to recognise and act on the economic and security threats of climate change. The Climate Change Act in 2008 is the basis of the UK's approach to tackling and responding to the climate crisis. It requires that emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are reduced and that climate change risks are prepared for. It also establishes the framework to deliver upon these requirements. The Climate Change Act committed the United Kingdom to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050 when compared to the 1990 levels. In June 2019, a new government plan was announced to cut greenhouse gas emissions to almost zero by 2050. The terminology used is net zero by 2050. That means emissions from home, transport, farming and industry will have to be avoided completely or, in the most difficult examples, offset, for example by planting trees or developing technologies to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. In 2018, a review of the implications and achievements of the Climate Change Act took place. The Act has been important for many reasons. It has formalised how the United Kingdom tackles climate change and provides a clear direction of travel while allowing for flexibility and innovation. It has maintained a remarkable cross-party consensus with agreements on carbon budgets. We have to be positive and recognise that since 2008 there has been a reduction in overall carbon by 21%. This has mainly occurred due to the rise in renewable electricity generation. When the Act became law, only about 6% of electricity was generated renewably. This now stands closer to 30%. However, while emissions from the power sector were down by 58% altogether, transport emissions have fallen by only 4%. In the last 10 years, the awareness of the population has grown, and now nearly 3/4 of the population are concerned. However, the reduction in carbon emissions has mainly been achieved by actions done to customers rather than by behaviour changes by the population. To reach the 2050 target, we need to reduce our emissions by 5% each and every year. This has not been achieved. We will see in the next session what this means for future reductions. More action is needed to ensure the nation is adequately prepared for changing average conditions and more extreme weather in the natural environment, built environment, infrastructure and through changing people's behaviour. As we have seen, since 1990 the fall in carbon emissions has been quite dramatic. 44% in total, with 21% since 2008 alone. We will look at the different sectors in the next session. For now, the most dramatic reduction has been from the power generation sector, but of the actions the government committed to in 2018, only 1 was delivered in full and 10 have not been done at all. And so, to recap, we have had a look at some of the vulnerabilities faced at different countries around the world and that the impact will not be evenly spread. We've had a look at some of the likely impacts in the United Kingdom around flood risk, wildfires and air pollution. We have had a look at the result of the international discussions of the IPCC and how they have shaped the legislation in the United Kingdom. We have seen the successes and challenges after the first 10 years of the Climate Change Act. In the fourth and final session, we will be looking at the carbon emissions by different sectors. We will see which sectors have responded so far, and we will look at the challenges as we work towards net zero carbon emissions.